In the last video we covered a whole glut of games TV that happened in the early noughties. There are some good points here and there, but on the whole it's fair to say that around about 2003 or so, games TV was in a pretty shocking state. That's odd to say for something that was never wholly good to begin with, but the days of Games Master were long gone. Hell, even Games World and Bits would have been welcome. This state of affairs kind of annoyed some people, in particular those who would have been called hardcore by Jamie and Darren, or SAD bastards by the Fun Bandits team. You know, the folks who actually really enjoyed games and wanted to see really good reviews of games. They didn't just want to see Gran Turismo and FIFA and what have you, they wanted a space for the more obscure games, because god, the coverage of the games on all these shows was just so bloody thin. Japanese games? Lol, they're just strange. RPGs? Strategy? Fuck off, weirdo. Somewhere after Bits, which to be fair actually did cover an okay range of stuff, game coverage just seemed to revert to nothing except races, sports and maybe the odd shooter. It was really quite boring, and the general tone was tiresome. People were, as I say, annoyed. Irked maybe. And two of them decided to try and do something about it. Something that would eventually bring Games TV, at least for a little while, back to television. And in the days before YouTube, it would result in one of the first popular gaming shows that existed entirely on the internet. This was one of the places where all the fun started. Here's where the magic happened, on a UK-centric games forum known as Woolmuck. Two of the forum's users stated their plan to make their own Games TV show off their own backs, where they'd do everything that they felt Games TV wasn't doing. They were passionate about games, inspired by the trailblazing likes of Amiga Power and what have you, with just a bit of a touch of Dominic in there to boot, a little bit of experience in actually making TV, and a white stonker for wrestling and Frey Bentos pies. They were Glaswegian after all. The Woolmuck forum knew them as Big Lime and Dandelo, but the world at large knows them as Rab Florence and Ryan McLeod. Rab had previously had some experience as a main writer for BBC's Scottish comedy series Chewing the Fat back in the early noughties, and Ryan, well actually he didn't have that sort of media experience, but it wasn't a requirement. This kind of thing was maybe a little fobbed off by the people at large at first. So many people say that blah blah, they're gonna make their own show, kiki this, a little bit of that, and hell it wasn't even the first of its kind. Over in America, Mark Bussler and David Crosson produced an internet gaming show simply called Game Room from 1999 to 2000 for nascent internet startup from USA Live. You might be somewhat familiar with this show as in 2008 it relaunched on YouTube as Classic Game Room and is pretty successful these days. Still, back in these times, plenty of people always said they'd like to produce something off their own back, but they always ran into problems, usually equipment, time and money. Big Lime and Dandelo would have these problems for sure, but they were serious and dedicated enough to plough on regardless, and with the goodwill and show naming abilities of the Woolmuck and NTSC UK forums behind them, they released the first episode of a show they called Consolevania in 2004. The production was, well, quite roughshod. As mentioned, this was well before YouTube. The first episode of Consolevania was actually distributed on CD to interested parties, mostly on the Woolmuck and MTSC UK forums, and from there those with some space would host them for sharing with everyone via BitTorrent. Money was a constant issue. There wasn't exactly a lot to begin with, and there was no financial backing whatsoever, meaning that the whole budget largely consisted of hiring in equipment. Capturing a video game for review was done by pointing a camcorder at the screen. You know, the sort of thing that Retsuprey folks would scream at these days. And of course there was the legendary coat hanger mic. It's a mic, attached to a coat hanger. What more do you want? That good old coat hanger mic, always chucked to whoever was on camera at the time. You can't beat it. Of course this did mean that the audio itself was somewhat questionable and tough on the ear. These limitations weren't going to stop them, however. They'd be going inside, outside, all around the streets of Glasgow to bring you better gaming content than anything that the old Gogglebooks could muster. And you know what? They did. Despite the limitations of their budget, Consolevania had one simple thing that none of the other Games TV shows could match. Heart. A clear, unconditional love for what they were doing and what they were covering. And they were actually really fucking funny to boot. But But in the main, just from the very first review of the series, appropriately enough, Castlevania Lament of Innocence on the PS2, you could see the difference, just in the amount of depth and appreciation they had for what they covered, and their ability to find the positives in everything, to look past the flaws or see them what they are and actually find out what made a game tick, and then communicate that to the people watching. Rab had a more flowery approach to reviewing, Ryan a little more pragmatic, but both were really damn good at it. The best thing about Consolevania for me in these early days was how many obscure titles they championed and even pushed onto me. Romance of the Three Kingdoms 8, Bajingai, Siren, Fire Pro, and later on the almighty Gitaroo Man.
And all the great Valkyries and warriors and horses are standing on guard, asking us, the people not the horses, what our favourite games were. We will say, fucking Gitaroo Man.
I probably have Consolevania to thank for the PS2 being my favourite ever console, just because it made me realise what a range of games the console actually had. The first series of Consolevania, cheap and erratic though it was, a monthly schedule was pretty hard to maintain, was chock full of these reviews and these little love-ins. Not that they wouldn't absolutely tear into a game if it was called for, because they damn well would. None more so than their pet hate, a somewhat obscure PS1 game by the name of Overblood. There was even room for a couple of little specials too. A Christmas special, a series-ending special on retro games that did its best to aid Doctor Who, and a whole episode on possibly their favourite game series of all, Resident Evil, including a spellbinding review of what would end up being their go-to favourite game, Resident Evil 4.
This is Resident Evil somehow, ducking, dodging, screaming, running, throwing, grabbing, sawing off your fucking head.
Reviews weren't all there was, naturally. What with Rab's experience with comedy writing and the like, there was a lot of humour. Gaming humour. Now usually the words gaming humour make me run away screaming, but damn it, Consolevania was funny. Much better than that penny arcade shit anyhow. In the main, Consolevania had recurring characters, the most famous of which in the early days was Legend, the almighty Xbox Live champion who'd beat Lisa Simpson 45 in a Mecha Soul deathmatch. He'd brave the streets of Glasgow on a Saturday night just to ask the general public the gaming questions that really mattered.
Alright, so tell me about Ridge Racer.
It's brilliant.
What's your best time?
What's
What's your best time in time attack mode? What's your best time in time attack mode?
Is he bamming me up?
No, I'm not bamming you up. I'm just asking you what your best time is in time attack mode. I'm just asking what your best time is in you play Ridge Racer, you don't know what...
I don't know what I'm doing.
Now this was never my favourite part of the show, but damn if that bit isn't gold. There were plenty others. John Gacy, Consolevania's #1 serial games reviewer, Mexican wrestler El Zomba, and of course Adolf Hitler, who'd appear somewhere in most shows and was played by a friend of the pair, Michael S. Hoffs. All these characters were fun, but no one could quite match the monumental, supernatural force that was introduced to the show in the 3rd episode. Kenny. The others may use all this highfalutin language or whatever, but Kenny? He'll show you how it's fucking done. Make no mistake. He can even show you how to play as Goro in Mortal Kombat. I like to think that they didn't actually do takes or anything with Kenny, they just let the camera roll and cut what there was. Perhaps the funniest parts were the one-offs though, such as this cringeworthy interview with a guy called Damien Murray, the manager of GeForce, a Glasgow games shop, from the 1st episode. Or this, A Day in the Life, a hard-hitting, fly-on-the-wall documentary covering the differences in life, activity and social strata between a rich gamer and the very wart on the bottom of society. Magic.
Obviously I've got a lot of time in my hands, but often I quite like to take some time out on the bog and read the Choo Choo Rocket manual. Medusa Clorungan's my favourite.
The first series of Consolevania was on the whole definitely something, even if the technical limitations also meant that sometimes a fair bit of time would elapse between each episode. The original plan was for it to be a monthly show, but they wouldn't necessarily always make it. But they got there and eventually started Series 2 in 2005, with all your favourite characters returning. And then, 2 episodes in, they stopped it. Why? Well, various reasons. Naturally a lot of them technical and budget related, but also, well, Despite the lack of a YouTube and the show's rather small presence, it had most certainly gained some momentum. People were really digging Consolevania, marking it out as something utterly refreshing when compared to all the pap you could get on the Gogglebox. Rab was even invited to talk about games on telly once, in particular the incredibly violent Manhunt which was in the news, and naturally Rab took advantage of that opportunity.
I mean, it's a game that features people getting bludgeoned to death, people getting bombed at the goal, people getting bombed at the goal, people getting bombed at the goal, people getting bombed at the goal.
It was enough momentum for them to pitch a games show to, of all people, the BBC, who'd never had a games show, ever. And bloody hell, they listened. Sure, it was only BBC Two Scotland, but still, a games show on the BBC. Damn! The first series of VideoGaiden ran at around 11 o'clock on a Sunday and consisted of 6 10-minute episodes. It was all very nice overall. A lot of the characters from Consolevania made an appearance here too, as well as some new ones. The lack of time meant there wasn't a great deal of time for the long reviews that Consolevania usually had, but they still made the most out of it. It was a lot of fun, and was far, far better than any games show that had appeared on television since, well, Games Master, to be honest with you. In the incredibly short time they had, they essentially produced a condensed and cleaner version of Consolevania and made the most out of actually having a crew and not having to throw coat hanger mics about all over the place. They made an impression, it was a very good one, and it was a shot in the arm for a format that was virtually all but dead. Finally though, 11 months after the second episode of Series 2, it would be time to kick Consolevania back into gear. Hitting TV wasn't going to stop that train. There is a marked difference between Series 1 and 2, particularly after the BBC excursion. There was more dedication to producing those monthly episodes, and they would be a lot tighter too. The BBC experience brought with it a much greater sense of professionalism, even if the equipment was largely the same. So gone were the near 50-minute one-times replaced by a lean mean half hour, usually with plenty of opportunities to take the piss out of big gaming figures of the day, like J. Allard. Anyone remember J. Allard? Or good old Reggie from Nintendo, or Ken Kutaragi. Usually all three at the same time.
I want it now, and I'm gonna come in his face.
A lot of the old characters went away too, including Legend, and even the coat hanger Mike said its goodbyes. But there was still Kenny, and there was still some awesome reviewing and the like going on. There would be more episodes based on a theme, like the X-Rated episode where Rab and Ryan had a look at porn games and whatnot, and the Independence Day episode, apparently filmed in a day and featuring various popular indie games of the time. And their taste in music was still bloody good too. Why do you think I always go ahead and stick tons of copyright baiting music in my vids? It comes from this show. So if this channel ever gets shut one day, you'll know just who to blame. There was plenty more fun too, like the Consolevania story, Rab and Ryan talking about the show intercut with words of wisdom from Ryan Blessed, the show's true director. I think all of these clips are taken from him talking about I, Claudius, but they fit bloody well. Few reviews get the actual appeal of something more than Rab simply spending all his time in Elder Scrolls Oblivion chucking shoes on top of roofs. And no review was ever quite as bitter and as twisted as Ryan's slamming of the somewhat obscure but horrific PS2 title, Seven Sins.
Good things about Seven Sins are like unlockable photographs of ladies that you have banged. This is a picture of me feeling Odo from Deep Space Nine's boobs.
Or similarly Rab's put down of the reliably, almost ritualistically boring Batman Begins.
I'm gonna catch you. I'm coming. Eventually. Oh, a thug takedown. Fuck off, Batman.
These were perhaps the show's glory days, tight as anything, funny as fuck, and above all else they were a team. A team that was becoming ever more confident and unafraid to call out folks for a right proper square go, calling out lazy companies, lazy reviewers. As time went on, Consolevania's voice became ever louder and ever more opinionated when it came to the state of games today. A big dollop of Amiga power influence perhaps. Still, there were now two babies to deal with. VideoGaiden was still a concern, with the Beeb going for another series in 2006, this time with 30-minute episodes. The more time the two got, the longer the reviews, the more this show became similar to TV but with its own touch. And it was brilliant. Honestly, Series 2 of VideoGaiden is the best games TV in this whole series of vids, at least when it comes to stuff that was actually on television. Games being taken seriously on British TV at long last. It was great. There are some fun running themes throughout the series, like the Shenmometer, Rab and Ryan's competition to respectively bring Shenmue back from the ashes or bury it for good. Following on from the increased focus on gaming issues and the like in recent CV, there were also segments with an ever more seething Rab spewing polemic at the state of games TV, games journalism, games collecting, and even gamers themselves. But the best thing was still the reviews, finally nailed once and for all, perfection. Not only for the bigger games around, but also for lesser ones, reviews that were even somewhat influential. Even though nearly every review the guys did was great, Rab's review of God Hand, a game that quickly became a favourite, was definitive.
The problem with God Hand is that it's just a game about punching people.
Excuse me! The genius of God Hand is that it's just a game about punching people.
Ryan sure as hell wasn't slouching either. His pointed, simple dismissal of Just Cause, you know, the original one that nobody remembers, is another highlight.
This is what it's like. I'll show you. I'm running! Look at me!
It was a great series. It seems silly to say that I've watched a review show again and again, but this? Yeah, I've gone through it a couple of times. And so it all continues. VideoGaiden finishes up, time passes, finally Consolevania comes back into play. We're still around 2007 or so YouTube was only just becoming a thing. They finally finished Series 2 with a special based around the Sega Dreamcast, and it was bloody glorious. Series 3 would actually feature something of a plotline, with a new character, Ziggy Springsteen, who'd hired the pair on behalf of a mysterious cabal called the Sponsors and was absolutely categorically not evil. The first 2 episodes were pretty much normal, same CV as ever, but then there was the 3rd episode, the Black episode, the one which apparently made the Sponsors drop the pair. This is pretty much just the weirdest episode of anything to do with gaming ever, still unmatched in that regard. I don't really know just what you can say about it, as it's indescribable. Some loved it and some hated it. I was pretty much the former, but it was still quite the head scratcher. The 4th episode of the series was simply called C, and didn't feature the boys. It was a send-up of the sort of games TV we mostly saw in the last episode, featuring Ziggy and his co-host Zach Eastwood. And yes, that is an early appearance for Brian Limond, aka Limmy, who as you may know is the single funniest man in the world. Series 3 was certainly an experiment, but it kind of ended up being aborted for various reasons. One particular event that didn't help was the release of 3.5, otherwise known as Lost and Found. For whatever reason, it was decided to hide the one existing copy of the review somewhere in Glasgow, apparently under a bin. So it was lost. Then it was found. And then it never appeared ever again. Someone had it for themselves. Or a council worker binned it. Who knows? A fluff piece commissioned by the Scottish games industry, which mostly consisted of Rab and Ryan laying out all the problems with the Scottish games industry, with the help of independents who were more than happy to talk about that, was a brilliant little project, true to CV's ethics, even though it no doubt ended up giving them a fair bit of grief. To top it all off though, another series of VideoGaiden. This time it would be restricted mostly to the BBC's website, but it would be 18 10-minute episodes of stuff, plus free TV specials, including, awesomely, a show which sent up games TV of old and less old. There's a riff on Micro Live, a riff on Games Master based on the Dave Perry incident, and even a riff on Bits featuring none other than Emily Booth herself. The Christmas episode of the show even featured one final Games TV appearance for that man himself, Mr. Pants, Dominic Diamond. Oh, and Frank Sidebottom, because I wasn't fanboying for the show enough as it was. The internet-only series was pretty great, fitting a whole load of characters and something of a plot into the time. Unhinged co-host Jerry McLaughlin, a surprise return for Damien Murray, a surprise appearance for Tim and Derek, and good old Zach Eastwood, the one character here who'd previously appeared on Vania. There were good reviews too, one of my favourites being Ryan's little review for A-Train HX, throwing in tons of history about the game and everything. Tried the game myself after this, and personally I thought it was shite, but hey ho, still a lovely little review. It was an FPS. Fans of Vitriol were also no doubt sated by Rab's review of Lost Theodomus, which might just be the single biggest savage in any game has ever received on any kind of television.
If you like this game, you're an idiot. If you buy this game, you're an idiot. If you made this game, then either I feel sorry for you for being trapped in one of the worst jobs on the planet, or maybe you're proud of it. Maybe you don't care, maybe you have no professional respect. Maybe all you deserve is contempt.
It made for fine watching, although by all accounts the boys were quite severely overworked. A lot of shit had happened, and there was a definite possibility that this series of VideoGaiden would be the end. As it goes, there wouldn't ever be any plans for a fourth series of the show, internet or not. But then it wasn't. Still they pushed on. Consolevania would return for a fourth series. Things would be a bit different this time. It's now late 2008, and YouTube is very much becoming a thing, particularly for gamers. The team would release reviews, skits and the like online, and would then combine them all up into a typical CV show released in the normal way, with added bits and such. No more sponsors, Ziggy or Limmy. It was an attempt to return to the classic style of old. One episode would be produced in this formula, and work did start on a second episode, including one final glorious highlight, a near 10-minute review of Fallout 3, featuring virtually no footage of the game, set to Nocturne by Kate Bush. It's quite considerably better than it sounds. I'm pretty sure that was the last video they did before once again disappearing. Finally, in 2009, there would be a resolution. A Consolevania Christmas Carol, which was actually described as the last episode of Series 3, and what appeared to be inevitable finally happened. At the end of the show, Rab explained that the team had felt too much that they were becoming negative about games, that was the way for them and they felt they were doing the same, when really they wanted to be positive and didn't want to crucify games anymore. Being in the same class as something like 0 punctuation wasn't their thing. I'll let Rab explain for himself.
If you were to ask me how I would like to see people refer to Consolevania, or refer to myself and Ryan and Kenny and Joanne and Michael, and it would be no as game critics or fucking game reviewers, or just people who love games and people who tried to make people laugh.
And yeah, that third series of VideoGaiden, reviewing games week in, week out, had burnt them out quite a bit and made them feel too much like video game critics, so to speak. Games were now suddenly a job. The love for games ultimately returned, but it wasn't enough to just change things up yet again. They had to kill Consolevania because they felt that it had run its course. At least Rab certainly felt that way. And so that would be it. After 5 years, Consolevania and VideoGaiden officially came to an end. Whew! That's a hell of a lot of stuff. It was a whirlwind 5 years, and to be honest there's a lot of things that I've not even mentioned. Things like apparently buying the movie rights to Hover Bother off Jeff Minter, for example. No, for real. There were a lot of other plans for things that ended up never materialising, including a repository for the show's history. No, really. That eventually did include commentaries for the first couple of episodes, and some MP3s of reviews they'd specially done for fans on the back of old 8-bit cassette tapes. There were plans for more, but for whatever reason it didn't happen. And the aftermath is certainly something too. Rab? Oh yeah, he's done stuff. He starred in and co-wrote, with writing partner Ian Connell, a sketch show called Burniston, which ran for 3 series on BBC Two Scotland. He recently directed a highly praised independent horror film called The House of Him. On the internet side of things, and quite soon after the end of Consolevania, he did a few episodes of something called Downtime Town, which explored his love of tabletop games. He still writes a column on the same subject for Rock Paper Shotgun. There's many other things too. Something called The Independent Charles Show, which appeared on Xbox Live, which focused on Xbox indie games. It was okay. A spectacular return to making videos about games called Will Somebody Please Shut Down This Fucking Amusement Arcade. Live shows about games, tons of stuff to do with wrestling, a short-lived but eventful column for Eurogamer, more internet video about games, more let's plays, audio books about the history of games. There's lots here. He's still very active. As for Ryan, well, he's stuck in the video scene too. He did a little show called Gaming Gents with Jerry McLaughlin, amongst others. It didn't get the attention that it deserved, but it was quite good. Nowadays, he does another video series about games called Chucky Dregs. This still isn't getting the attention it deserves, and you should probably rectify that. And he does a turn on the popular, hilariously named podcast Game Wank to boot. A lot of the old Consolevania and VideoGaiden crew still run together, from Jerry McLaughlin to Michael S. Hoffs, and even the odd appearance here and there from the now much more famous Scottish BAFTA award-winning Limmy. However, it appears that as of a couple of years ago, Rab and Ryan fell out and the pair are no longer on talking terms, so it's quite unlikely that we'll see Consolevania return anytime soon. Alas, it's dead, Jim. So after all this, and even from my admittedly biased point of view, what to make of Consolevania? I come to the show as a massive fan, although I would not say that it was a show for everyone. Some might find the old stuff just a bit too cheap, and I certainly wouldn't blame someone for finding Rab and Ryan much too opinionated. They wore their heart on their sleeves, they loved you if you were with them, and they'd scorn those who weren't. Sometimes they rubbed people up the wrong way and they put more than a few noses out of joint. It shares the same quality that something like Pop World has, the sense that the establishment were never big fans of it and would prefer it if it wasn't there, especially in the days before YouTube. And there was definitely a rise and a fall. There was a time when the series got lots of attention, enough to get them featured in magazines and the like, enough to get them a show with the BBC. But the irregular schedule perhaps worked against them in the end. Ultimately, Consolevania started appealing to just its core fan base and wasn't getting much attention outside of it. One thing that is quite clear is that it came well before its time. If Consolevania had started in, say, 2008, so it could have hit the YouTube wave and hit its peak right at the peak of internet reviewing, maybe things would have been very different. Maybe it would have been one of the biggest things going. But then, would it have been the same sort of thing? Who's to say? One thing to note is that at around the same time that Rab and Ryan released the first episodes of Consolevania, a guy from New Jersey released a couple of videos on his own website where he got quite angry about a couple of old NES games. He didn't do much else with this until YouTube came along, when his friend persuaded him to stick them on there. The videos went viral, the angry Nintendo nerd character was revived, and the rest is history. The path for reviewing games on the internet was set, and it was a path that ultimately didn't include Consolevania. Still, for fans of the show, like me, oh boy was it a fun ride. Personally, it does remind me a little of a fairly dim, inactive period. That's certainly something, but it was one of the things that got me through that. It was there throughout most of it. And honestly, yeah, it taught me a lot about how to do this sort of thing. Still does, in a way. And so that's Consolevania, that's VideoGaiden, and that's the end of this series. There is no more games TV to cover. Someone on Twitter asked me recently if I thought we'd ever see any games TV ever again, and I said no. Things are just, well, so different now. In the end, games found the big audience it could always get, right here on YouTube, and on Twitch. They're entirely catered for on here, no matter what you like, whether it's the hottest stuff off the press, or the most obscure thing you can possibly think of. And so TV, which has always seen games as competition, if not the enemy, well now they don't even need to bother. In a way it's good because there's so much out there, but it's also kind of a shame. TV always has that different air, you know? It's more professional, no matter how good your favourite reviewer's DSLR is. And it brings different forms of media together too. It adds credibility, in a way. I can't help but feel that coverage of video games being basically an internet-only thing has made the community as a whole a lot more insular than it once was, and even less trusting of the outside world. As big as they are, it doesn't seem that video games are ever going to be something that influences popular culture the way it did back in the days of the 16-bit wars, or the PlayStation generation. And games TV, while certainly not the biggest part of that, certainly played a role. Its very existence was oxymoronic and subversive. It was something that was never quite welcome, something that was always treated with distrust and often manhandled pretty badly, something that the industry itself was almost wholly incompatible with. But, going back to the words that Dominic Diamond closed out Gamesmaster with, to the viewers, frustrated though they may have been, it meant something.